welcome to Conversation Groups. We're starting a new series. Yay!
Yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah. Series is called At the Movies, so why not do groups at the movies? Today I've got Pastor Mike with us, and we're going to be talking about hope in times of loneliness, kind of looking into the story of A Man Called Otto, that movie, but then also looking at the story of Ruth and Naomi. And so sit back and enjoy. We're going to have a good time together.
Good.
So we got to start off with a fun question. So our fun question today is, if they made a movie about your life, who would you want to play the role of you in that movie?
Well, it sounds like an easy answer, but I would say Tom Hanks would
Okay.
be a good one for me. I think he's got a funny side with Forrest Gump and Castaways, and yet he's got a serious side with A Man Called Otto, and maybe even a bitter side. I don't.
He plays the
That part
grumpy.
doesn't fit me,
He
but-
plays the grumpy guy pretty well.
He's not the extroverted guy, he's just kind of the middle of the road kind of guy.
Plus, he's like
so.
the best. So why not?
Sure,
if
why not?
You're gonna have somebody play you,
pick
get the
somebody.
best.
Yeah. Yeah.
So-
I mean, Brad Pitt would be, but that wouldn't well, probably.
That's a stretch. All right, getting serious here. So the movie A Man Called Otto, there's the main character Otto, where he is redeemed from his loneliness because of his neighbors reaching out to him, the kindness of his neighbors. So in that story, kind of what do we learn about our need for community?
I think one of the things that you see in the movie is that he's lonely, he's bitter, he's lost his wife,
Mhm.
and he just hasn't really got a lot to live for, it seems like. And his neighbors just continually try to love him and care about him, bring him food,
Mhm.
and they need him to help with things around the house and things like that. And he doesn't think he needs anyone, but they really do. And at some point, she even lets him know that you need people, whether you know it or not. You need people, and so I think that's one of the things that I see in that movie
Mhm.
is just their persistence.
Yeah. You can't really. There's kind of this like, oh, I'm a self-made person, and it's just not true. No one is
Yeah.
really self-made. You need other people in your life, whether we like to admit it or
Yeah.
not. So
Right.
we're going to be looking at the story of Naomi and Ruth. Thought we would actually give you guys a chance to watch a video that kind of walks through their whole story, and maybe as you watch that, see what comes out to you, what stands out to you about our need for community.
The Book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are three main characters in the book: Naomi, the widow, Ruth, the Moabite, and Boaz, the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line, "In the days when the judges ruled." And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi, and she says, "Wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God." And so the two of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of the chapters begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future, and that's followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz, and each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taken place. This story is beautifully designed, and that design actually connects with a really interesting feature of the story, and that's how little God is mentioned. Right? The characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator actually never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story, and that's its brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, but actually the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he's doing so through Ruth, through her boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, but not without Boaz, who's a no-nonsense farmer who's full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses his integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. And so this story brilliantly explores the interplay of God's purposes and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. And that leads to the real end of the story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Oved, was the grandfather of King David, from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about.
All right, so looking at the story of Naomi, Ruth, Boaz, what do we learn about our need to help other people find community?
Yeah, I think it's just so important. There's so many people that you don't know what's going on in their lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the same with the man called Otto, is that they didn't know what was happening in his life, and didn't know that he really needed them. And there's so many people around us, I think, that we don't know what's going on in their
Mm-hmm.
lives. We hear things as pastors all the time of what's going on in
Yeah.
our church community, and it's overwhelming. And yet most people don't know. They walk in, they smile and say, "Oh, I'm fine," but we really don't know. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's important, I think, for us to find that community for people, and it's so rare these days.
Mm-hmm.
It really is.
Yeah, I'm really impressed by Ruth in this story. Like, she's not a believer or a believer in God, Yahweh. She's from a
Right.
completely different culture, and she's
Mhm.
willing to accept Naomi's culture, kind of to pursue her, to say, we're not going to leave you out here
Yeah.
alone. And Naomi even tries to push her away, and then finally like relents after Ruth's persistence of like, no, we're going to do life together, and your
Yeah.
God's going to be my God, and we're going to do this together, and I'm not going back. And then when they arrive to town and Naomi is still like, well, I'm going to change my name to Mara. Don't call me Naomi anymore because my name is bitter. So she's had
Yeah.
Ruth go alongside her, but even still, there is just this hardness, and because of all the losses that she has
Yeah.
endured, and it just takes a really long time in her story before redemption can really take place for
Yeah.
her, where there's hope.
And I think with the losses, sometimes you begin to feel angry and you push people away,
Mhm.
because you think, I'm not worthless. I'm upset with myself. I'm what's happening in my life. And Naomi was blaming God, and she probably wasn't the greatest to be around, being a bitter, angry old woman. And for Ruth to run away with her mother-in-law was quite the thing, of love, and had found some community there, obviously, with Naomi. And it's just an interesting thing where we tend to push people away whenever we have things like that happen in our lives. Yeah. And that's the times when we really need people. Mm-hmm. And so I think as we look at other people who might be bitter or angry around us, and they want to push us away, we need to find ways of still being in their lives, instead of just letting them go off.
Yeah, it required Naomi to be open to receive from Ruth, but it also required Ruth to be pretty persistent.
Yeah.
To keep going, to pursue relationship with Naomi.
Exactly.
We're going to look at Galatians 6, chapter 6, verse 9 through 10 here. And here it says, "So let us not get tired of doing what's good." I think there were probably the days where Ruth was tired of doing it. "So let us not get tired of doing what is good. And at just the right time, we will reap a harvest of blessing if we don't give up. Therefore, whenever we have the opportunity, we should do good to everyone, especially those in the family of faith." So what opportunities do you have to bring community to maybe those that are lonely around you?
I mean, as far as for my wife and I, we have kind of begun to build a little community in our neighborhood. We have a court, and our court is really good. They're always texting almost too much. I had to block them because I was getting 50 texts a day from our court. But
it's very Tom Hanks of you.
But they really have found that they like the community, and they don't have anyone else. And so it's nice that we can all go outside and we hang out together, and we're just trying to build relationships with folks there and kind of see where that might go. And obviously in the church, we're trying to build some community with folks and small groups and things like that as well.
Yeah. I think that's why groups are so important. And those of you that are sitting around watching this, like, you have each other. Even if you are sitting in a group today and still feeling lonely, like, be open and share because that
People
group is there for you. Yeah. Well, this week as you go, would love for you to read through the story of Ruth and Naomi. You can read it in the book of Ruth. As you read through that, look for kind of those ways that God wants to speak to you about bringing community to those who are lonely. Every week, we say this every week, but we always want to be a church that is known for love, and we can be known for love when we are persistent with those who are lonely around us. So have a great week.